In the dead of the Cold War, one of the world's greatest powers believed it could be struck without warning. A secret program was launched to detect that strike before it happened. This is the story of Operation Ryan, the Soviet gamble to foresee a U.S. nuclear first strike, and how its paranoia nearly brought the world to the brink. Welcome to the channel. In today's video, we'll dive deep into Operation Ryan, a lesser-known but chilling episode of Cold War history. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll walk chapter by chapter through its origins, its methods, the crises it provoked, up to its eventual decline, and examine moments when the world came close to catastrophe because one side feared a surprise nuclear attack. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Origins of Operation Ryan. In the early 1980s, the world stood at one of the tensest moments of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, weakened by economic stagnation and haunted by memories of surprise attacks from the past, grew increasingly convinced that the United States might launch a sudden nuclear strike to destroy it. At the center of this fear was the aging leadership of the USSR, especially General Secretary Yuri Andropov. As former head of the KGB, Andropov was deeply suspicious of the West and obsessed with the idea that the Americans were planning to strike first. He believed that the Reagan administration's rhetoric, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, was not just propaganda, but preparation for war. In 1981, Andropov authorized a top-secret intelligence program known as Operation Ryan. The name came from the Russian acronym Raketno-YAdernoe Napadenie, meaning nuclear missile attack. Its mission was simple in theory, but dangerously complex in execution: to detect any sign that the United States and its NATO allies were preparing a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. To carry this out, the KGB sent classified instructions to its stations all over the world. Soviet agents in Washington, London, Paris, and Bonn were ordered to observe every possible indicator, from movements of military aircraft to unusual power consumption in government buildings, even sudden increases in blood donations that could suggest preparations for war casualties. This paranoia was fueled by real Western military developments. NATO was deploying new intermediate-range missiles in Europe, capable of hitting Moscow within minutes. The US was advancing its strategic defense initiative and increasing nuclear alert drills. To the Kremlin, all these moves looked like the final steps before a devastating first strike. Operation Ryan marked a turning point in Soviet intelligence history. For the first time, the KGB was tasked not just with spying, but with preventing the annihilation of their own country by predicting an enemy's hypothetical attack. It blurred the line between defense and delusion, between vigilance and fear. And as the Soviets collected more and more ambiguous data, one terrifying truth began to emerge. The more they searched for signs of an American strike, the more they believed one was coming. Chapter 2. Inside the KGB's global network operation. Ryan became one of the most extensive intelligence efforts in Soviet history. Its reach stretched across continents, involving thousands of KGB officers, informants, and analysts. Every Soviet embassy and trade office was transformed into a miniature early warning center. Agents were told that their task was of extraordinary importance. They were to find proof, not simply evidence, that the West was preparing a nuclear attack. This mindset created a dangerous feedback loop. Uncertainty was replaced with assumption, and assumption with fear. In London, KGB operatives watched military bases and followed the schedules of senior British and American officials. In West Germany, spies monitored NATO headquarters, airfields, and even local hospitals. In Washington, Soviet agents tried to decipher signals from the Pentagon, counting how many cars were parked late at night or whether the lights stayed on longer than usual. Reports flowed daily back to Moscow, where analysts in the KGB's center compiled data into thick classified folders. They built a complex matrix of indicators, hundreds of potential signs of a nuclear strike, from the mobilization of blood reserves to the evacuation of Western leaders. Many of these signs were based on logical reasoning, but others bordered on paranoia. Every cable that mentioned increased security at a military base or an unusual message from the White House was flagged as a possible warning. The KGB even instructed agents to monitor small details, like whether Western officials' families suddenly left town. an imagined clue that they were being evacuated before an attack. Inside the Soviet Union, the military also became part of the operation. Satellites, radar systems, and early warning networks were synchronized to detect the slightest anomaly in Western movements. The goal was total vigilance, but it came at a cost. As information piled up, the KGB's analysis grew increasingly distorted. The system rewarded reports that confirmed danger, not those that questioned it. Doubt was treated as disloyalty. And within the walls of Lubyanka, the KGB's headquarters in Moscow, fear became its own form of evidence. By 1983, Operation Ryan had transformed from a defensive program into a living engine of paranoia. And soon, a real-world event would test just how far that paranoia could go. Chapter 3. The year 1983. On the brink, 1983 was the most dangerous year of the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis. For the Soviet Union, Operation Ryan had already reached full intensity. But what made this year so critical was that reality started to echo their worst fears. Early in the year, U.S. President Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, a plan to build a space-based missile defense system. In Moscow, this confirmed Andropov's suspicion. The Americans were preparing for nuclear superiority, and once they had it, they would strike. In September, another shock struck the Kremlin. Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian Boeing 747, accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace and was shot down by a Soviet fighter jet. All 269 people on board were killed, including a U.S. congressman. The West called it a barbaric act. The Soviets, convinced it was a spy mission, believed the U.S. was probing their defenses before an attack. Tensions skyrocketed. Then came November 1983, the moment when fear and miscommunication nearly triggered nuclear war. NATO launched a massive command post exercise called Able Archer 83. It simulated the transition from conventional warfare to nuclear launch, complete with realistic communications, coded messages, and even new procedures that the Soviets had never seen before. To the paranoid Soviet intelligence machine built by Operation Ryan, Able Archer didn't look like an exercise. It looked like the real thing, the first phase of an American first strike. In Moscow, Andropov and his generals were alarmed. The KGB ordered its stations to monitor Western military activity minute by minute. Soviet nuclear forces were quietly placed on alert. Ballistic missile units were told to prepare for possible retaliation. In East Germany and Poland, Soviet pilots sat in their cockpits with engines warmed, ready for immediate takeoff. Communication channels buzzed with panic. And all of this was happening because of a misunderstanding, a tragic result of a system built on distrust. But what saved the world that week wasn't diplomacy or negotiation. It was luck, and a few men who refused to believe that war had begun. One of them was Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who, just weeks earlier, had faced another terrifying false alarm. His decision would become legendary, and would prove how close humanity came to destruction in 1983. Chapter 4. The Man Who Saved the World. In the late hours of September 26, 1983, just weeks before the Able Archer crisis, a Soviet early warning station outside Moscow registered the unthinkable. Its computers reported that an American nuclear missile had been launched toward the Soviet Union. Moments later, the system showed 4 more. The officer in command that night was Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. His orders were clear. If the system detected a U.S. launch, he was to notify the Soviet leadership immediately, which would almost certainly trigger a full-scale nuclear retaliation. But something didn't feel right. The readings were too clean, too few missiles. Petrov reasoned that if the Americans were launching a real first strike, they wouldn't send just 5 missiles. They would send hundreds, enough to obliterate the entire Soviet arsenal. So, in a moment of calm defiance, he disobeyed protocol. Petrov reported the alarm as a false signal. He waited, minutes ticking by, knowing that if he was wrong, millions would die. But no missiles ever came. He was right. The alert had been caused by a reflection of sunlight on high-altitude clouds, misread by Soviet satellites. Petrov's quick judgment prevented what could have been an irreversible escalation. He later said, I had a feeling that nothing was going to happen. It was a gut feeling. That instinct saved the world from nuclear war. And yet, he was never publicly honored by his government. In the shadow of Operation Ryan, his decision exposed a chilling truth. The Soviet system had become so consumed by fear of a US first strike that a simple technical glitch could have triggered the apocalypse. The same fear that drove Operation Ryan nearly destroyed the very nation it was meant to protect. Petrov was reprimanded, not celebrated. His superiors feared that acknowledging the false alarm would reveal deep flaws in their early warning system. He retired quietly from the military, haunted by what might have happened if he had followed orders. But history would remember him differently. To the world, Stanislav Petrov became a symbol of reason in an age of madness. A single man who, through logic and courage, saved humanity from annihilation. Yet even after that night, Operation Ryan continued. The paranoia didn't stop. The KGB kept searching for signs of a Western attack, convinced the danger was still real. And that obsession would shape the final years of the Soviet Union itself. Chapter 5. The Collapse of Operation Ryan. By the mid-1980s, Operation Ryan had grown enormous but directionless. The Soviet Union was drowning in fear, bureaucracy, and contradictory intelligence. Andropov's death in 1984 left the operation without its original architect, but his paranoia remained embedded in the KGB's culture. Under Konstantin Chernenko, the project continued out of inertia. The KGB still gathered data from around the world. Every diplomatic meeting, every NATO maneuver, every American military test was treated as a potential precursor to war. But internally, even some senior officers began to realize the absurdity. They saw how every normal Western action was being interpreted as a sign of nuclear aggression. Operation Ryan had become a self-feeding illusion. Then in 1985, a new leader rose to power, Mikhail Gorbachev. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev didn't view the West as a monolithic enemy. He wanted reform, transparency, and above all, to end the arms race that was bankrupting his country. As he opened dialogue with President Ronald Reagan, the foundations of Operation Ryan began to crumble. For the first time in decades, Soviet and American officials sat face-to-face to discuss nuclear disarmament. The Geneva Summit of 1985 and the Reykjavik Summit of 1986 marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War's darkest paranoia. Inside the KGB, some officers resisted change, still clinging to their years of fear and suspicion. But reality was shifting. The USSR's collapsing economy, the disaster at Chernobyl, and growing public unrest made it clear that the real threat wasn't a US nuclear strike. It was the Soviet system itself falling apart. By 1987, Operation Ryan was effectively dead. The KGB no longer treated it as a priority, and its reports lost influence. The Soviet intelligence apparatus that had once scanned the world for signs of Armageddon was now focused on survival. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union dissolved 2 years later, Operation Ryan became a relic of another era, a cautionary tale of what happens when fear replaces logic. In the end, no American missiles ever came. But the paranoia they inspired nearly brought the world to its knees. Operation Ryan remains one of the most haunting reminders of how fear can drive nations to the edge of destruction. It was not an offensive plan, nor an act of aggression. It was born entirely out of terror. The Soviet leadership truly believed they were defending their country from an inevitable US strike. But in doing so, they created a system that almost triggered the very catastrophe they feared. Today, historians see Operation Ryan as a psychological mirror of the Cold War, proof that mistrust and secrecy can be just as deadly as weapons themselves. The world survived those years not because of technology or strategy, but because of human judgment. People like Stanislav Petrov, who refused to let paranoia dictate the future. As we look back, it's a sobering lesson for our own time. Nations still build weapons, still conduct surveillance, still prepare for the what if. But the story of Operation Ryan reminds us that the most dangerous moment is not when the enemy attacks, it's when we start believing they already have. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Cold War history, consider subscribing and exploring our other documentaries on secret operations, intelligence, and the hidden conflicts that shaped our world. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and remember, history's most dangerous weapon has always been fear.